Hello again, and welcome back to Freedom's Herald, your defense against the growing tyranny and destructive actions of modern leftist thought in America. Hi, I'm Tom Gandley. Ladies and gentlemen, with any feel-good political policy that is mandatorily enforced through legislation, bureaucracy, and eventually paramilitary or societal violence, the line separating winners from losers is blurred, as the authoritarian element which has wrested power away from the common man seeks to hold on to that power by obscuring history, facts, and mostly the reality of what precisely they're handing out to the community they claim to represent. All the while they'll sugarcoat or downright lie about exactly what they want to impose on the unsuspecting masses. We'll be right back with more in-depth analysis right after this short break.
Hello everyone, this is Brad Neufeld, host of Resilience. You can catch my show every morning at 8 a.m., Monday through Friday, right here on the Resilience Talk Network. Tune in to discover what it takes to overcome any challenge that you may face in life. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome back. And the discussion at hand is focused on what the promise of socialism, so ardently presented to the younger generation, though surely bought into by older folks as well, some would accurately call it indoctrination in our public school system, really has as its aim, and to what purpose. By now, we've all observed on some news program or another the unrest in Latin America brought on by a socialist nationalization of business. Food shortages, a military and civil authority clearly under the thumb of a dictator, and a government in place that displays unquestionable disregard for the welfare and, of course, authority of the common folks. That nation is Venezuela. There have been mass exoduses to neighboring countries, and a conservative estimate has it that over 1 million Venezuelans are now living in refuge in Colombia. Hundreds of thousands have fled to safety elsewhere: Peru, Ecuador, and even the United States. The nations where safety and a stable economy are not compromised by a socialist government whose sole purpose, like any other socialist government, is to maintain its heavy-handed authority over its own citizens at all costs. Poverty, starvation, mass exodus to other nations by victims of their own government characterize Venezuela, a nation that amazingly also has an oil reserve, no joke, 10 times greater than the United States, coupled with an output production cost of much less than the United States. So where does all the money go? Who gets wealthy in socialist countries and why? Not the common man. Let's briefly go back to the start of humanity's flirtations with socialism in the modern era, the Soviet Union of 1917. American progressives in that bygone day cheered the Bolsheviks taking over every aspect of the Russian government and forcing socialism, at gunpoint as we all know, on the populace. With that unfortunate power vacuum being plugged with purveyors of the world's newfound economic blasphemy, natural forces of supply and demand and private property ownership for the purpose of earning a living were completely chloroformed. The new socialist regime paternalistically usurped the nation's resources by, in the words of economist Jeffrey Tucker in a recent issue of National Review, quote, full nationalization of industry, work mandates, controls on trade, the pillaging of agricultural lands and produce, rationing, and centralized distribution of basically everything, and a full ban on private enterprise, unquote. So let's go back to the question I asked a few moments ago. Who gets rich, or at least is made more comfortable under socialism? Who benefited the most from the newfound panacea of Soviet Union socialism? Well, after only a year of government price production and labor controls, grain production dropped by 50% in a single growing season. The result? Not that I need to overemphasize it, because you can guess, but a huge famine broke out that was not repaired for years, and between 1918 and 1921, and estimates vary, between 3 and 10 million Russians and almost as many Ukrainians died of starvation. The new tyrannical ruling class and their enforcers of socialism never missed a meal. Now, what nation in the Western Hemisphere is currently suffering as badly as Russia in the post-World War I era? You know who it is. And yet, despite the measurable and predictable failure of the top-down command and control socialist state like Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, Cuba, and, let's not forget, Zimbabwe, young Americans have increasingly been dragged into believing that socialism is a superior alternative to the democratic free market economy. They call themselves democratic socialists, and their icons of the moment, Bernie Sanders, longtime senator from Vermont, and the left's newfound it girl, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, have advanced the image of socialism while leaving key elements of their agenda conveniently out of their speeches, talking points, and overall narrative.
Tuition free. 3 months paid family and medical leave. Healthcare is a right of all people, not a privilege.
Free education, free Medicare for all, free jobs that pay the living wage arbitrarily assigned as, for whatever reason, $15 an hour, even for the most menial employment. If common sense and understanding income generation, taxation, service sector efficiency, and real employment levels is the determiner of who you cast your vote for, it should never, ever be for a self-proclaimed democratic socialist, and currently it would seem any Democrat, period. Allowing these people unfettered control in Washington, D.C. will be to allow them unfettered control over every element of civil structure and aspect of you, the citizens' lives from birth through education to employment, Medicare, and to death. It'll lead to failure, frustration, corruption, as it is every place it has been given quarter. Even the most scientific effort to hone socialism into a practical system of needs-based productivity failed. Soviet economists, well-educated men all of them, were commissioned to do just this under none other than Nikita Khrushchev from the 1950s into the 60s. Called the Schleifer-Vishny theory, the attempt was made to scientifically fine-tune government tyranny in the economy so it could outproduce the capitalist West. The main problem, and Khrushchev's economists had to be aware of it, was that the absence of market forces in achieving market equilibrium were fundamental, as they are to any socialist central planning, to the success of Schleifer-Vishny. Khrushchev, his faith placed in this bogus plan, then coined the familiar mantra, "We will bury you," meaning, more innocently than it sounded at face value, that through scientific honing the old Soviet Union would outproduce Western capitalism-based systems. But shortages always occur at some point for some necessities. And when the culture of Soviet terrorism died with Stalin, the culture of Soviet corruption began with Khrushchev. And those shortages resulted in the signature lines or queuing up for necessities. Necessities that even the poorest folks in the U.S. take for granted. Despite that for a longish while, about 70 years, the socialist system of the Soviet Union did manage to lumber along in its slow, bleeding, resource-misusing way, staving off famine and, for the most part, economic collapse, until a small Soviet recession, followed by a trip to a U.S. grocery store by then-Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, led to perestroika and the dismantling of the USSR, and a more seamless, less violent than others, transition to a freer market economy. They're still working on it, of course. But these are the cliché obvious examples and failures. More obscure are the quasi-socialist, or the more innocuous-sounding statist attempts at government control over only certain elements of the economy. Let's look closely at the oft-touted healthcare system in France. In a recent article in the National Review by Pascal Gaubry, it was recognized American leftist rhetoric is conditioned to blame life expectancy differences between the rich and the poor on healthcare availability, and cite France's system as one we should try to emulate. Vox, a leftist information source, even going so far as to blame President Trump's tax cuts on life expectancy differences. Yes, that was an attempt at a serious correlation. But considering healthcare inequity in a nation, the U.S. is, in reality, in the middle, right alongside France. Additionally, France pays its doctors far less than the U.S., $97,000 a year on average to start. And nurses holding a Bachelor of Science can expect to make about $24,000 a year to start. And the French healthcare system, highly subsidized at the national level, has been running a deficit for the past 17 years. And French government-controlled childcare, mysteriously extolled as the world's best, has been experiencing a shortfall of openings for the number of children needing it. François Hollande, France's previous president, promised to create thousands more slots, or crèches, during his campaign circuit speeches, but those promises were abandoned after his election. Corruption abounds in France, whether in healthcare, child daycare, housing market availability, or labor utilization. Because of centralized labor regulations, most jobs are temporary, since employers don't have to give long contracts to all workers and no business owner wants to give himself a major labor dispute when contracts expire. In the UK, another nation the US left just gushes over when comparing healthcare systems, it's somewhat better. Here, too, statism still leads to want. In 1960, England could proudly say it had the largest, most productive economy in Europe. But in less than a decade, it had fallen far out of first place. Partly this was due to other nations like Germany and Italy, for instance, doing some post-World War II catching up. But the most destructive force vis-à-vis England's economy rested right inside its borders. The Labour Party gained control in 1964. You can guess what happened next. Higher taxes and greater government intervention into the economy. In the UK, they had already had enough of both. According to economist Andrew Stuttaford, the pound devalued, and after a few years, the Brits were smart enough to put Tories back in charge by 1970. Unable to correct the problem created by the increased government meddling in only about a decade, Prime Minister Edward Heath's body of leadership decided to go Keynesian. If you haven't heard that terminology, you certainly know the irresponsible practice. The central government, unable to dig itself out of a stagnated growth rate and high unemployment, decides to go into debt and spend its way to prosperity. We've seen this all done to excess in the U.S. Every presidential administration going back to Kennedy has tried it. One inescapable reality of this statist economic ideology is rising national debt. The knee-jerk reaction to a struggling economy run by radicals is almost always the same. 1. Soar government spending by, you guessed it, 2. Taxing the rich. In the UK, taxes on the quote-unquote rich topped out at a whopping 83%, and 98% on investment income. Talk about government theft. Inflation in England, because of these extremist socialist policies, ran up to 24% in 1973. Things got so bad that even the Labour Party, which held a slim majority in Parliament, eventually became more austere in an eye-opening moment of clarity. But wage and price controls have an opposite effect on inflation. In other words, Labour's attempted statist controls only made things far worse as a result of their assault on the free market. By 1975, the pound plummeted versus all foreign currency. The London stock market crashed, real estate prices were stagnant or dropping, and many Britons began emigrating to other countries. From having the beefiest economy in Europe in 1960, the British economy, after galloping towards socialism for over a decade, had to cave in to an International Monetary Fund bailout in late 1976. Now, for those of you who remember, that was exactly what bankrupt Greece and Spain needed just a few years ago. Labor, the workers themselves, rebelled and struck after promises of huge union-driven pay increases failed to materialize. Their incivility and greed left trash piling up in the streets and even corpses left unburied in graveyards. Middle-class Britain had had enough before long, and a year later, Margaret Thatcher was in residence at 10 Downing Street, and conservatism had won back the country, returning it over time to the people and the free market. We'll wrap things up in a few minutes after these messages.
Welcome to the Resilience Talk Network. My name is Jay Walter, and I'm the host of Rebuilding. heard every weekday night from 6 to 7 p.m. You can listen in and learn how to face your fears, overcome obstacles, and make dreams a reality. So listen every weekday night from 6 to 7 p.m. right here on the Resilience Talk Network.
After a recent trip to Las Vegas, after departing one morning and with the long and almost unchanging scenery facing me for my 400-plus miles back home, I was passed by a large pickup truck, pulling life's essentials in a 24-foot flatbed trailer. Into the sunrise we both drove, I in the California-plated vehicle, and as I looked at the items in the trailer, I noticed a box spring and large mattress, upright against the drop-down gate of the trailer. A big piece of cardboard, attached to the mattress by bungee cords, summed up an emotion held by those traditional freedom-loving people now fleeing the many leftist states of the U.S. That hand-drawn message, written on a 3-by-3-foot piece of ripped cardboard with a black marker pen, was poignant and reminiscent of those values that became the ethos and laws of our great nation. Goodbye, California, it said. Overtaxed and underrepresented, we're heading anywhere else. The threat growing within our nation has been and continues to thrive in the havens of leftist institutions, and the active genocide against conservative ideology has as its handmaiden the oceanic tide of illegal aliens whose presence in our country redistricts our representation and devalues our franchise votes. I'm pretty confident that that's exactly what was driving those folks in California to anywhere else, as they say. As my fellow traveler just outside Las Vegas understood, taxation without representation is unfair. And in relocating to anywhere else, he proved socialism, or if you prefer the watered-down term statism, ostracizes, alienates, and eventually kills the spirit of the free market and a citizen's right to unfettered initiative. This has been Freedom's Herald on the Tribe of Kings Information Network. I'm Tom Gandley. Technical assistance for this episode has been provided by production manager Brad Neufeld. Special thanks and recognition to the June 3rd edition of the National Review and authors Sean Regan, Andrew Studiford, Pascal Emmanuel Gobry, Kevin Williamson, and Jeffrey Tucker, whose articles provided historical information for this podcast.